Hey everybody, welcome to the Dad Challenge podcast. My name is Josh and today is Monday and I've been speaking with one of my moderators who's been helping me out. Wander with Intent, if you're out there listening, you are. Thank you for kind of teaming up with me on this. YouTube's gotten out of hand. I've got to learn how to do this properly so that maybe I can one day do this. So Wander and I sat around, and you can check out her link below to go see her channel. We are sitting around thinking about, what am I gonna do to make this thing awesome? Because I'm just kind of like everywhere with it. And that's how my brain is. And it is who I am. But I decided I was gonna step up and kind of make a weekly schedule. And I'll try to stick to it as best I can unless I'm traveling or working or, I have different things to do. But Mondays are now gonna be reserved for kind of uncovering religious and church issues and truths. Right? So it's going to be this place where I can do like investigative exposés on things like the Mormon church, which is going to come up soon, in the Christian church, which I'm going to talk about today. And we're going to do little just videos on certain parts of the church that, I don't know, piss me off or that are doing it wrong or are doing it right, because there's a lot going on in the world of church and ministry and religion and all these things. And it's not all the same. And so that's what I'm going to be doing on Mondays. And for the next few weeks, we're going to talk about things inside of the church that kind of bother me. And today we're talking about tithing. Next week, we're going to talk about, church monoliths, talking about this $10 billion plus church building industry and what it means for people of faith and what it means for people coming in and what it means for people who don't believe, right? We're going to talk about worship wars, which is like the music wars that you see inside of churches and music and tastes. We're going to talk about paying pastors, talk about wealthy, rich pastors and like getting into that type of ministry where the wealth and prosperity ministry. Joel Osteen, you asshole, looking at you. Bad leaders, Joel Osteen, looking at you. Mega churches. We're gonna dive into this whole subculture of like religious. Basically, I'm gonna focus around things that I kind of know with mega churches, and so we're gonna go way into this together. And I'm really excited because this is my jam. Okay, if there's anything that's my jam and I'm passionate about, it is church culture and the shittiness that it is. And it's time to start uncovering it. I mean, it's mostly uncovered. Most people who are awake and have been, are woke about this type of thing understand it. But there are people who go to church who don't understand this stuff. And some people who are being taken advantage of. And there are people who just don't realize that there are freedoms outside of this thing. And that a real faith actually doesn't actually include going to a building with bricks and listening to a pastor give a TED talk on a Sunday. You're about to be woken up to what church really is over this next series, and I'm really excited about it. Today, we're talking about tithing. I know it's the biggest one you could talk about right off the top. It is the most contentious, sometimes often least spoken about thing inside of a church. Churches don't want you to know what they bring in. They have to because they're nonprofits. Many of you know I'm an ex-pastor. If you don't know that I'm an ex-pastor, I've got a whole series you can watch right here, okay? Head over there, watch the series. It gets crazy, okay? And it's still not done. I'm still trying to figure out how I can release the recordings to the public, and it's just gonna cause a huge stir. It's gonna be insane. But basically, churches value optics over anything else because optics matter, because it's just like politics. Optics matter. If you're seen to be doing something wrong, you're gonna lose congregants, right? If you've done something, if there's a pastor that's done some dirt and you bury it, you control the optics. If you fire someone illegally like they did for me, you control the optics by putting out false statements, right? And so churches hold their optics in such high regard over everything else, over the gospel, over how they treat people. Optics are everything for churches, and tithing is one of those big things. So I've got some notes here. If you see me looking over here, that's why, because this is really, really in depth. And I want to break it down, and I don't want to miss anything. Let's just get right into the nitty-gritty of what tithing is, okay? Basically, the church will say this. Most churches will say that tithing is 10% of your income after taxes, okay? So 10% of the juice that you get. Like, you wring it out, give me that 10%. It's based on an Old Testament law where you gave your 10% to the storehouse, which is the church, technically back in the day, okay? And that was really important. I want to preface this all by saying that giving is really important, right? Very important. I think in the Old Testament it says that in the Old Testament, it's the Lord Almighty said this. It's the God himself said, he says, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, okay? Test me in this. Don't miss that. God literally has never ever, and faith is important, where he's like, don't test me in any of this. Like, God basically says, have faith, and it's there. You just have to have faith for all this. And that's a contentious part of Christianity in itself. You just have to believe. But there's no other time in the Bible where God says, test me in something. We're like, literally, test me. Watch this. And he says it here. It's a big deal. So giving, God is saying, test me in this. If you give, watch the blessing that will be returned to you. And I am a full believer in that. I didn't start tithing until I could afford it, which was dumb. Should be tithing no matter what. And this was back in the day. I started tithing and my life took a completely different turn. Like, it was just what a different world when I started tithing and started giving generously, right? And I still, to this day, I still tithe, but I don't tithe to the church anymore. And we'll get to why later. So in the US alone, we're going to stick to US statistics because Canada's like this big compared to the US, okay? And most Canadian large mega churches copy the US anyway. So this definitely carries over. So in the US, there are 247 US citizens who identify as Christian, okay? Varying levels of Christianity. But that is a lot of people. That is a majority of your population who will say, yeah, I'm a Christian. The US would be considered a Christian country, okay? For, and that might trigger some liberals and stuff, but it is. You're literally viewed as a Christian country all over the world. But only 1.5 million of those 247 people tithe, according to CDF Capital, okay? We gotta look at the Old Testament versus the New Testament. The Old Testament, it was a different time. God literally dwelled among the people and in these places, and you had to give an offering. And it was your best. You couldn't just give like a little bit of leftovers. It had to be the best of the best. We talked about that in David's Dedouche part 2, where David's guys went and got him water from his well because he wanted it. It had to be his well. They brought it to him, and that water was so valuable that David, instead of drinking it, poured it out as an offering to God because it was so valuable, okay? Giving God your best, and 10% of your best is the most important thing back in the Old Testament, okay? But there's literally nothing in the New Testament that talks about giving or tithing to the church. Doesn't exist. Because when Jesus came, died on the cross, and the veil was torn, the temple was busted, no longer did those old laws apply. But so many churches are still relying on Old Testament law to coerce you or to tell you about spending. And some churches actually believe the Old Testament law still exists today, like Leviticus and all these things that just don't. If you're a new believer, a post-Christian like I am, it's all about the New Testament. It's all about what Jesus said. That's kind of what is law and canon for me. If Jesus said to do it, I'm doing it. And Jesus basically just told us how to love people. That's it. All this judgment on gay people and all this other thing that's going on based on the Old Testament law is just bullshit. So stop listening to it. That's just my take on it. And I will be chastised for that for biblical scholars. Also, it needs to be said, I'm not a biblical scholar, okay, people? I'm just a regular dude who reads the Bible sometimes and studies on this stuff because it's really important to me. And I lived in ministry for 7 years, full-time ministry, okay? So I lived it, I worked in it, it was my career, I studied it, I went to Bible college. I am not smart when it comes to biblical knowledge. I know a little bit. And so when I get all this stuff, it's basically just me saying this. It is not scriptural canon, okay? Do your own study. That's where we all get this wrong anyway. Go out and figure this out on your own. The Bible is there for you. There's many texts out there for you to read. Praying, do all your own stuff. Stop just listening to a pastor and that's the law. That's a lie. Don't do that. Don't listen to me either. Go do your own studying. Anyway, New Testament doesn't talk about tithing at all. Jesus doesn't say about it. Being generous? Yes. Giving? Yes. All that stuff is there. Okay? So do we need to tithe as believers? Well, there needs to be a distinction between tithing and giving. Okay? So we're just going to call it giving from now on. Okay? Tithing is the Old Testament word for giving 10%, is what I'm going to say here. It probably isn't, but it is. And the answer is yes, you do need to give, and you need to give generously, and you need to give that it hurts. It needs to be sacrificial. You can't just be like, I got an extra $5, I'm going to throw it in the plate. Or I got this, I'm going to throw the extra out. It just doesn't have to be the first of it. Giving has to be giving, and it has to be giving generously. Okay? It just has to hurt. I do believe that's out of obedience, and just it's important. So there's no New Testament or scripture or command about where you tithe. Okay? Giving is very important for a few reasons. Okay? First, you get a tax break a lot of times. You give to a church, you get a tax break. You give to a nonprofit organization, you get a tax break. Giving is important. Without giving, like without generosity of people of cultures, like the world ceases to exist. Okay? Giving is an inherent human trait that we do. We give, whether it's money, time, love, food, hugs. We give things, right? It makes you feel good. imagine at Christmas, like as a dad, I hate Christmas. I don't like getting gifts because I buy my stuff throughout the year and I don't like getting gifts. But who doesn't love when your kid is opening the gift they don't know if they're going to get it, right? They don't know, but it's that one gift. Like I got my son Tyson AirPod Pros for Christmas and he didn't think he was going to get them. And it was like the last thing, it's always the last one you give them, right? It's after all the socks and all the trash. And he opens them and it's just the light in his eyes. You love to give because it just feels good in your soul. Like there's nothing wrong with that either. Giving because it makes you feel good. Go for it. All these guys on YouTube are like, who get called out, well, you're just helping that homeless guy to get views. Okay, cool. Give, do it. Whatever it takes to make you feel good, to give, that's okay. That's kind of part of it. Giving makes you feel good. And it's supposed to. That's part of the inherent biology of it. Okay, that's science. It's also being obedient to Jesus' teaching about being generous. Jesus was generous, and he talks about the tax collectors and guys that he hung out with and people. He's like, one tax collector's like, how do I get to heaven? He's like, you got to sell everything and give it away. And that's hard to hear for a lot of people, right? It's a lot. And people need you to give, right? They need you to give. There are a lot of people who don't have a lot who need people to give. And the church gives itself. The church takes in what it takes and then it gives out too, right? Just not as much. So pastors who talk about giving and tithing as if it were Old Testament law, you can't have it both ways. Okay, and a lot of these churches do that. They pick and cherry pick from the Old Testament what they want to believe, right? Wow, Leviticus says it can't be gay. Oh, well, you have to tithe. Oh, well, this and that. And, but they don't want to, you can't eat shellfish, can't wear clothing with mixed fabrics. They don't want to take all those other things. They just want to take they cherry pick what they want to fill their own pockets or to fulfill their own, mission statements and their own, hermeneutics and all the things that they want to believe. They pick and choose. All churches do this. No one is exempt from it, okay? But the Old Testament basically doesn't really stand anymore as far as the law is concerned, especially when it was the way it was written. It doesn't work that way. So you can't have it both ways. Your church either stands on the Old Testament and is like it's all part of it, or it doesn't. Tithing is Old Testament. You had to do that stuff. God, you burnt things as an offering and God took that and he was pleased with offerings. It was just very important. It just does not happen in the New Testament. Jesus changed the game forever for all of this. And we're forgetting that. So today churches will rely on Old Testament scriptures to give their members in tithing. But did you know, according to PushPay, okay, that tithers only make up 10 to 35% of a congregation, which is generally way on the lower side, 10%, okay? So meaning most churches that are out there, 90% of the giving that is brought into a church comes from 10% of its membership or 10% of the people who go. In my church, the one that fired me illegally, there's an elder who I believe, and if I'm right from hearing, has given multiples upon multiples of millions and millions of dollars to this church to help build it, to help put it where it is. And he's basically the right hand of the pastor, which is generous and amazing because it's his money to give. He's wealthy. He has more money than ever be able to spend. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with it. But it needs to be said that those who give like this sometimes will expect a certain amount of power inside the walls of those churches. Not all the time. And I'm not saying that this person who did give that money is that person. I'm just saying this happens a lot. And it can shift the leadership, the dynamic of a church and goals of a church to make tithers happy. Okay, so this guy's giving millions. He sits on the elders board. So he's in the leadership position of the church anyway. And so these people who give tons of money, often they do. And not all the time, but often they do. I know lots of wealthy people give who don't say boo. And they're like, here's your money. That's because they do it right. But often people who give will sometimes say, well, I tithe here. And that gives them a certain level of privilege, like meetings with pastors and sitting on certain boards and doing certain things. And that's just like politics. That's wrong. Okay? So churches need to make sure people who give are the ones they keep happy, which is contrary to teaching of the Bible. Most churches say, come as you are, and the outreach, and no perfect people allowed. But the outreach is quelled because those who are the whales who give a lot are often the ones who complain the most, who are the ones that pastors will often bow to and change things. In my case, there were a bunch of givers and big whales who didn't like my style of music, and they were vocal about it. And those are the people that pastors often tend to bow to, put their knee down and put their foot down and say, we got to change because this person's going to leave and then we'll lose money. If you don't think that happens, you are blind. It absolutely happens a lot. So it's a dynamic that is not sustainable. Even now, most types of givers are boomers. They're older people, right? And they're dying off. What's a church? Church has to figure out what they're going to do next because young people don't give. Rarely do they. All the students in the church that fired me, none of them gave. But they also had the least programs, given the least attention. They didn't matter. People who matter in churches are the people who give, and that's bullshit, and that needs to stop. That's why tithing is so contentious. And they try to guilt people into it. Number 2, giving has never been easier, okay? At the church that fired me, they kicked the bucket, per se. So they don't take it an offering. They don't actually pass around a basket. In the announcements to the front, they're like, don't forget to give, and here's you can text to give. And so, which is bad and good, right? The lead pastor of that church dreaded, just absolutely, you could tell he'd nervous sweat if he had to talk about giving. Hated it. Never ever wanted to talk about it because he felt that because they were a seeker sensitive church that giving is like turns people away. It turns them off. Like I come to church and give money. Why is the first thing when I sit down is you ask me for money? And some people will say that, but giving is really important. So he shies away from talking about it for the bad, but good because it brings people in and they see that, oh, that's cool. This church doesn't want my money. I'm going to stay here till later. Because when he comes up for an emergency situation or he needs something or whatever, he has to talk about it. And it's like every 2 or 3 times a year, we talk about ask for extra money because they don't take money, right? But one of the most important parts of our faith we can't forget is giving. And so when he doesn't tell people that giving is important, when he doesn't put importance on it himself, it shows people that that's not important. And it really is. So he's doing it wrong, basically, out of the fear of for putting butts in seats. Because again, remember, less than 10% of people give most of the wealth at that church. And like I'd say 2% of the people give the lion's share of the wealth at that church. So he doesn't need to worry about it, right? Even now during COVID, the church's numbers are like this big, from 2,000 to like 500 on a Sunday, even, and that's probably fake. Their budget is flush because the government's giving them money and these rich people are writing checks. So why worry, right? But you can give by text, you can give by cash in a box, you can give by offering plate, you can give by calling in now. Giving is so easy because most people just want to tap, pay just quickly. Don't want to give cash. No one gives cash anymore. So churches who are on board, like modern churches, on board for all these modern things, they get more. But smaller churches can't use the modern things because the modern things cost money. That's why smaller churches are dying off. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. It is the world we live in. And this also formed a massive industry alone. PushPay, Tithely, all these companies take about 3% of your giving as their fee, right? And for the churches, for the privilege of using their services, right? You give them money, they take 3% off and give it back to the church and they do all the stuff, right? So it's a rising tide that lifts all ships, except for the smaller ships get sunk, right? And it's now become a multi-billion-dollar industry, tithing online. These companies are just making bank off churches. Bank. Lots of money. And according to nonprofit source, charitable giving in church is this. 49% is made on a card or by some kind of digital means, right? 8 out of 10 people who give have zero credit debt. That's a big one, okay? People in debt don't give, right? People who are wealthy give more generally. We'll go back to that in a minute. 60% give digitally. That's huge, okay? Churches that take online donations increase overall giving by 32%. That's a big number, okay? That's a big number. My ex-church's annual budget's $3 million. 32% of 33 million of $3 million, it's a lot of cash, okay? It's a lot of money. Look at this. The same magazine, I think Nonprofit Source talked about another guy who wrote in Relevant magazine, said if Christians tithe 10%, okay? If all Christians who said they were Christians tithe 10%, there would be $165 billion available to the church. Like $165 billion a year, okay? And according to Mike Holmes from Relevant magazine, it only takes $25 billion to relieve global hunger and eliminate death from preventable diseases in 5 years. The church could wipe out global hunger and eliminate death from preventable diseases. 15 billion would solve world water and sanitization issues in the world. 15 billion, okay? 12 billion ends illiteracy. 1 billion funds all overseas missionary work, and we're going to talk about that soon. So churches are bringing in a ton of money. They're not bringing 165 billion. They're bringing in roughly $1.92 billion a year in the US alone. And a lot of that is just put in pockets of staff, and that's fine. We'll get to that another day, paying staff members what they're due and what they're owed, and I think that pastors should be paid. I absolutely do. I will be the person that says, pay your pastors, pay them well. But don't, be careful, okay? There's a carefulness there. Well, here's the craziest stat of all that. People who make $20,000 a year are 8 times more likely to give to the church than people making $75,000 a year. Right? That's a weird stat, but that's crazy. So why is tithing so contentious? Well, because most churches already pay zero tax on property and other things. So churches already enjoy paying no tax on things. So it's not like they're bringing in money to pay tax. They're bringing in money and it's all in their pockets. And they have to spend that money. Nonprofits generally have to spend all their money. You can't just store it away. You can put a little bit away, but you can't bank it up. You can't raise it up. You have to be spending it. And so churches who are increasing budget over time, they have to spend that money. They have to hire people. They got to buy expensive things. They have to. It's just like the government. You have to spend your budget so you get a bigger budget next year. That's crazy. Another reason why tithing is so contentious is because pastors are living the high life. Not all, mind you. There are a select few pastors out there who live wealthy. Look at Preachers and Sneakers on Instagram, okay? This one uncovers these mega church pastors who live like Kanye West. They rocking $1,000 sneakers, $4,000 belts, $10 million watches. Like, they're so expensive. Pastors should live well, okay? They should be paid well because pastors give of their time and their energy and their spiritual energy, and it's a very exhausting job to have. But if a pastor is living in exorbitant wealth, there's a disparage there. If there are people in your church who are suffering, who are poor, who are living on food stamps, who can't afford anything, but your pastor's living the absolute luxury and wealth, you're f***ing doing it wrong. Okay? You're f***ing doing it wrong. At my ex-church, the annual budget is $3 million. And the salaries are close to 60% or more of that. So there's a lot of waste in just salaries, a lot of bloated salaries, especially for the executive pastor who's like, doesn't do anything. A lot of pastors don't do anything, get paid a lot. And the lowly pastors who do all the work get paid less. It's just the way the church is literally emulation of the world. And it shouldn't be, okay? Churches are using it for internal purposes more than external kingdom building. A church's job is to make disciples. That's what we're here for, right? So when you give $1 to a church, 1 penny of that might go out to the community or to missionaries. 1 penny. Okay, depending on your church. Some churches do it differently, but generally 1 penny, and hardly any goes to outreach. At my ex-church, they spent well over $300,000 alone on this crazy, insane indoor playground equipment that is beautiful, and kids love it, and I loved it, and my kids loved it. And they justify this by saying it's an outreach. But I know firsthand from working there that they might bring in, if you're lucky, 10 people a year because of that outreach. 10 people maybe come in. And there's nothing wrong with that. Could you imagine, though, how much $300,000 goes in the real world? How much further it goes than playground equipment? A lot of churches use these big dollars to build these crazy buildings in sanctuaries, and they have the best tech and the best facilities because it draws more people, which in turn draws more money, which is big numbers, right? Churches need to be this place, have become this place of like the Sunday morning social club experience, where it's like, oh, you go to that church, it's got all the cool stuff. It's got the coffee bar. It's got the cool playground. It's got all the cool programs. It's got all this, and they grow because they can afford it. And it's just like corporations, grow. But there's barely any real outreach because here's the truth, people. Most mega churches, modern churches, are only bringing in people who come from other churches. They're not bringing in new believers. It doesn't happen. The numbers just don't justify this expenditure. I'm sorry. It doesn't. It just becomes a place for Christians to gather and hang out in the best place. Like, I love North Point, but those people spend exorbitant amounts of their wealth on the craziest programs and their staff. And it's like, it's almost debauchery how much gets spent on inside the church alone. Now, churches rarely help those in need inside their own walls. This is why tithing is contentious. Why people are, if you're not going to help people, why am I going to give to you? In my own ex-church, I know specifically of a few people who reached out for some help. Okay. And so and this church gave locally to a few things, backpack drives, but they relied on the people inside the church to bring those backpacks in. The church isn't paying for the backpacks. They're literally just people bring them in and they distribute them, and the church gets all the credit. Okay. Food bank, same thing. Bring in all your food. But I know so many stories of stories inside of church of like single moms and people who actually need help, who the church is actually afraid to help them because they're afraid, because if they help that person will talk about how that church helped them, and then it'll bring other people out of the woodwork to help them. Churches are afraid to actually give monetary things to help people. Now, a lot of churches do, and they do it, but they do it kind of silently. But that's kind of dumb. Especially if a church is wealthy, should be given to those people that need it, right? And so that's why so many people will leave the church, because they don't get the help that they look for. The church should be a place where you go get help. The government, yes, the church should also be. And some people are like, well, the church isn't here to help you and pay your groceries and do that. Yeah, that's what the church is for. That's what Jesus would do. That's what people are supposed to do with the church's money. The church's money is not the church's money. It's God's money. You should be spending it on people who need it. But the church is scared to do so because they set a precedent if they do. And so most churches won't. Or they'll do a little bit, tiny bit that doesn't do any help. Churches in general fail to exhibit the same generosity they ask of their people. Time and time again. Ask your church, if you go to church, how much they give to the community. And you ask for a number, okay? Someone commented on one of my videos a long time ago, I never forgot it. If the church needs money, they ask the person. If the person needs the money, the church tells them to pray. Okay? They bring all this money from the people, but rarely help people. I'm not saying that a church, yeah, I am saying that. If a church has wealth, give it. That's what it's there for. So yeah, I am saying that. It is. If poor people come to your church and need food and money, give it to them. That's what it's for. That's Jesus' money, not yours, douchebags. So let's talk about building and capital fundraisers. This is a big one, okay? So you're hanging out your church. You go to your church. Your church has pews. It's growing. Oh, we gotta get rid of these pews. Our sound system's a piece of shit. So every 5 years, it's time for capital fundraising campaign, right? You know this. It's coming down the pipe. They're doing car washes and bake sales, and they're asking you for extra money at Christmas. Then they're saying go above and beyond. Most churches have zero debt, okay? And they build these insane facilities off the backs of their congregants in the name of giving to Jesus. But what it really is, it's a monolith and like a trophy to the pastor or the founding members. Large churches are generally trophies of big pastors. They're not for God. They're like, look what I have built. I've heard many times my ex-pastor talk about how he built this place. And people even talk about it even if he doesn't, says, oh, well, he built this place and he's done it from ground up and he's poured his life into it in his place. No, it's God's church. It's not yours. It's basically their claim to fame, their influence, and it's not Jesus. They're taking away, even if they don't say it, it definitely comes across that way a lot, right? Which is the case in a lot of big churches built off the fame of their main pastors, okay? And it's just provable. But when a church is built off the fame of a main pastor and that pastor falls or leaves or whatever, and all the people leave, it's just proof right there. People are going to church for pastors. And that's effing stupid. Stop it. Okay? Joel Osteen, I'm looking at you and your giant friggin' monolith built in your fake white smile, and you're just a snake. Joel Osteen is a snake. He actually didn't even open up his church when there was a flood, and he got called out on it. Not enough. He should have been canceled. I can't tell you how many times someone on my staff, even I did at my ex-church, talked about raising money for a specific project or something above. Executive pastor and main pastor kiboshes that instantly. Nope, not doing it. We already have a plan for our money, right? And it gets cut real quick because it takes away from main giving. And even if it does get through, right? I asked to create my own GoFundMe to write a Christian album. Nope. Cut it. Like there wasn't even a conversation. Nope. Zero. Not happening. I had to ask for a person on my worship team who came up with the idea that she would give money as a tithe so that it would come into that. And even then they had a problem with that. So it was crazy. They just don't, money to them is like everything, okay? A church has to protect it at all costs. So even when they do have to come out and say they need money, it needs to be stated, this phrase, above and beyond. If you hear this phrase in your church, run away. What they're telling you is that we need more money from you and it needs to be above and beyond your regular gift. Or if you want to give to this specific thing that we're doing at Christmas or whatever over here, it needs to be above and beyond. We don't want you taking your money that you're going to give to us and put it over there. You still need to give us your money, but make sure that if you're going to do that, that you make sure that it's above and beyond what you already give us. They always say that. Can't tell you how many times my executive pastor had to say in writing or from the stage or video, always with the asterisks, above and beyond your regular giving, right? They want to make sure that you know your regular giving needs to keep on going. It's icky. It's disgusting. And it happens at every single church. This is one of those things where I say, not all churches are bad, but most churches do this. And they have to. They're a business. Here's what I propose. I know this video is kind of long. I don't care. Stop giving to these monoliths. These trophies to these pastors and their fame. Stop it. They don't need it. All these pastors who say, "Oh, I don't take a salary from my church. I build my wealth off my books." Okay, well, then you should pay for your church's bills. You're already a millionaire, trillionaire. Cool. Then you should pay for it. That's your church anyway, right? We all know it. Start feeding homeless people, clothing homeless people. Start helping people in need, single moms in your area, your own family. There's people in your own neighbors need help, okay? Single moms. Supporting missionaries, that's a big one. Supporting community centers, pregnancy centers. Put your money where it can do the most good. But, and this cannot be stated enough, it needs to be given in Jesus' name, whether or not you say that out loud or it's in your heart. In your heart, it's fine. If you genuinely give within Jesus' name in your heart, you're good to go. But put your money where it's going to do the most. All these Christian organizations and churches, you give them $1, they give a penny. This is terrible. I understand people need jobs and they need to run all through the things, but some of these heads of these companies like Compassion and all world, whatever they're called, their heads make bank. And we need to start calling that into check. And these things need to be run on volunteers, or not, at least not paying these people $400,000 a year to do that. You can tithe, give directly to where you need to do it with just a little bit of time, a little bit of elbow grease. You do it yourself, and it goes a lot longer, and it does bigger things for the kingdom. Okay? Stop buying pastors' shitty books. Churches now, this is a pastor will come out and say, well, I don't take a salary. This is their big thing about how they justify their wealth. I don't take a salary. I sell my books. But your church has 50,000 people who all bought your book. You're literally using it as an MLM. You're saying, buy my book. You're still taking money from your congregants, but they buy your book. Stop buying these shitty books. They're all garbage. Except for Andy Stanley. He's got some good ones. Start supporting good authors. Okay? And stop allowing megachurch pastors to live in mansions while the majority of their congregants live in poverty, okay? If your pastor drives a Lexus, start asking some questions. If your pastor lives in a giant house, start asking some questions. There's nothing wrong with a pastor making money. I'm not saying that. But you know, and people know, the disparity between living a decent life that's great and you're still good, and then being super wealthy, okay? Because then that's what it becomes for them. That's their bread and butter. And they live this lifestyle and they don't want to lose it. And so they'll do anything to protect it. Pastors are not perfect. They're not infallible. They're not protected. They are just as susceptible to evil as anybody else, especially when it comes to money and power and corruption. If not more so, because they're being attacked. Here's a cool one. Start seeing your time as tithing, as giving, as generosity. Okay? When I do video production for anybody, my day rate is $1,200. Okay, if you want me to come do projects for you, you're paying me $1,200 minimum. My time is valuable. Okay, that's 8 hours. I'm making more than $100 an hour. Then I'm editing and doing everything else. My day rate is expensive. When I'm giving to a church of those gifts and abilities that I have, I'm literally giving them $1,200 if I'm working for the day. That's the way I see it, okay? You do not need to give dollar bills. Your time is valuable and it is money, especially in this day and age where time is very valuable to everybody. And I believe in God's eyes, it is seen as the same. And I could be wrong. I just do believe that if you give your time out of Jesus, in Jesus' name in your heart, right? Then this is so self-evident when a large church does everything it can to protect its giving in its language. Volunteerism is not considered giving. It's just considered volunteerism. You kind of have to do it. So here's another thing you can do. Give to smaller churches. I know in my family there's a pastor who serves at this tiny little church. And any amount of giving will help. They need your money more than these giant churches do. So think about these. These pastors, they often live on bread and water. They're the poor ones, and they shouldn't be, because they're actually the ones preaching the gospel. But people don't want to hear that. They want to come to the TED Talk at the Monolith down the street. They don't want to hear the real gospel, right? They don't want to be guilted to live in a proper life. And these little church pastors are generally the ones who are talking about this stuff unapologetically. So do it for the love of the gospel, okay? So if you love the gospel and you love what Jesus teachings, those little churches are doing it right. Big churches tend to not do it right. Give to a smaller church. If you want to support a small church pastor, I got one you can support. Reach out to me, send them the money. They need it more than these giant pastors who drive Lexuses and live in big houses, okay? These pastors tend to live very, very lean, and they do all the same things as a megachurch pastor but even sometimes more, because they have a smaller congregation, meaning that they're more accessible. Big, giant megachurch pastors don't meet one-on-one with people. They don't do one-on-one counseling generally. They don't do the little bits. That's what they hire the other pastors to do. So a small church pastor does more, gets paid less, and talks about the gospel more. They are more valuable than these giant asshole pastors wearing $500 shoes on Sunday. Oh, I'm on it now. I'm on fire. Let's do this. Give to your missionary friends. I have missionary friends, okay? You all know someone who's a missionary. Missionaries are the salt of the earth, okay? They need it more than the church needs it. And the church often will support a missionary like this much. And that person usually has to beg a church, and a church has to turn away many, 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 many missionaries. My friend, Jeremy, him and his wife, Lindsay, they adopted a kid. They came to my church because they have family that goes there and asked my church for money. My church told them to piss off. But it's just a tiny amount. Missionaries are the ones, I believe, who should be showered with earthly riches. They don't even want it. That's the point. If you don't want it, you should have it. But if you do want it, you shouldn't. That's something for you, okay? Put that in your pipe and smoke it. Not these megachurch pastors who are lazy and rich and don't do anything, and sometimes literally rip off other pastors in their messages, okay? Missionaries often risk their life. They are separated from their families for large swaths of their life, and they live generally in third world countries and sometimes get sick, and sometimes it's just not the best life sometimes. Those people I talked to about who adopted, Jeremy and Lindsay, they can't have kids. Okay, and they're missionaries. They give their life to God. They teach. They're teachers, and so they live in Papua and they teach, and they want nothing more than to have a big family and to just adopt as many kids as they possibly can. But because they're effing missionaries, right? They have to raise every penny that they go to. They raise every penny, and they have to beg people. It's like, and people are like, oh, here they come again for money, and the missionaries have to they have to literally humble themselves, crawl on their hands and knees to their friends and pastors and everybody else to ask for money every year. And it's the most stressful thing you could do. Missionaries need to stop having to do this. Churches need to step up and give way more of their wealth to missionaries. Missionaries should be living, like, even if they're living out in missionary fields, I'm not saying they should be living in mansions out in missionary fields, but they should be having a large storehouse built up for them so when they get back, they can have a house. They don't have to, they can retire early. They live hard lives. They've given their whole life to Jesus, okay? So Jeremy and Lindsay are out there, and they want to adopt again. But their first adoption, they begged so many people for money and barely raised any. And they're broke because of it. And they want nothing more than to raise others. So if there are missionaries out there who need something, give them money. Jeremy and Lindsay's GoFundMe is here. You need to give to their GoFundMe so they can adopt more babies, because they do it right, not like Mike and James, those assholes. These people have this beautiful child and they want more beautiful children. They want to raise them and they're amazing people, but they can't because they're poor, because they're missionaries. Give to your missionary friends. Don't give to your church. Your missionary friends will love it. Even if you give to like missionary funds, like those missionaries tend to work for, they have a company that you give the company the money, then the company spreads it out, right? There is a service that they do and it is valuable. But even they take a cut. Look, I'm not saying you should all do this, but find a way to put that money you're going to give to your missionary friend into their bank account. You will not get a tax return for it. That's okay. You're still giving in the name of Jesus. Just because you didn't get a tax return for it doesn't mean it's not tithing or giving. Okay? Find a way to get your missionaries some money or some things that they need. Send big giant bags of food and products that they need. Missionaries do not get propped up enough, and they need to. Big ass churches can suck it because they do not support missionaries enough. And those who do, I'd love to find out who you are, and I'd love to call you out and give you props, because I know there are some out there, but rarely do they. If you're worried about what God thinks about giving the way I'm talking right now, here's a question. You see a homeless woman who needs a new pair of shoes, a new coat, and she needs a meal. And so you do that. You buy this homeless woman, a nice jacket, a very nice meal, and a nice pair of shoes that's going to last her through the winter. Okay? Costs you about the same that you would tithe on a Sunday, depending on your salary, right? And then your church all of a sudden comes out on Sunday and says, look, guys, we need a new projector. The other one's, the color's off a little bit. It's got a little bit of fading in it. We need a new projector. It's going to be $50,000 for a projector. And don't get it twisted. That's relatively cheap for a nice projector, okay? And you give that same amount. Which one served the kingdom better? The homeless person that needed it, who needed food and clothing and shoes and warmth and support, or the church who already has a projector, or probably 5 sitting in the wings, but they need a better one. Now, I'm not saying that God thinks one is better than the other, but on earth, one means more than the other. One does more things for God than the other. But as long as you give in his name, it's important. They both serve well. But just think, that's a question. And if your church says, no, giving the projector is important because here we bring more people in, we bring more. This is how the churches justify this type of thing. We need to build this up so that more people come here, more butts in the seats, more money means that we can give more to the community. No, it means that you're giving more to the staff. As you increase in money, you pay out more to your people and you waste more. Churches waste so much money, okay? The increase isn't very small if it does go to the community, if at all. So giving directly outside in Jesus' name is always, in my opinion, Jesus is going to smile. He's going to be like, good for you. And bro hug you. Okay? That's what Jesus is going to do. So tithing is important. Yes. Giving is important. Yes. But how you give it has to make sense. If you're supporting a church that's doing it wrong, then you're just as much to blame when they misuse it. And if you know it, and if they have misused it and you haven't called them to account, then you're just as much to blame. Like my church, remember we talked about how there was $150,000 over budget on a $300,000 project, and there's a $75,000 playground sitting in the lobby? No one called them on it. I'm the only one who called them on it. And guess where that got me? Fired. Okay? So there's so much waste inside large churches. And how do I know? I lived it. I wasted the money. I'm just as guilty. But they always ask for more, and it's never enough. We would spend on things there's no reason to, or the pastor would say, get the expensive one, right? Smaller churches do this really well. They run really lean and do really good production. I've always been the guy, tried to buy the cheapest stuff and get the better production. I'm good at that and hire people who do that, because I had actually blog called Big Church, Little Church. And I was passionate about helping smaller churches get big church production on small budgets, because big churches just spend because they have to spend. They have to spend. And there's so much waste. So much waste. Like 20% of the money that they spend is wasted. No joke. Most big churches are like that. They waste. We do at the movie series every year. They waste money on these stage designs and Christmas and spending $15,000 to $100,000 just on a Christmas service. For what? For people who come out once a year? They're not coming after that. It's such a waste of money. In conclusion, sorry this is so long. Giving in Jesus' name, no matter what the target, is always the answer. It's always right. But don't let the church guilt you into thinking you need to tithe to their brick walls, their mortar, their projectors, their sound systems, their salaries. Because the church isn't a building. It's not that pastor up there. It's not the place where you go to have coffee and eat cookies and your kids run around, okay, where they get babysat for a couple hours. A church is a community of believers gathering together. That can mean in someone's basement. That can mean together around a fireside. That is the church. The church is a community of believers, and there is no more Old Testament storehouse anymore. Okay, it doesn't exist. And when someone says that, oh, you got to build up the storehouse, tell them to f*** off, because they're wrong. Don't tell them that, but tell them that they're wrong, and tell them to come talk to me. Giving is one of the most important aspects of your faith, and you should do it, because it actually is a game changer. Giving generously is a game changer. I promise you. And again, I'm going to go back to the beginning. You should give so it hurts. It needs to be sacrificial. And you will be blessed because of it. If you're a believer in Jesus, and some of you aren't, and that's okay. But if you give in Jesus' name, you will be blessed. I promise you, it will happen. He even says it. Test me, even though it's Old Testament. But again, it speaks volumes because God actually says, test me in this. So regardless what you believe or not, God still said it. Test him in it. Give in Jesus' name and watch what happens to your life. I promise you, it will be a game changer. And here's another thing. Make sure you start asking questions to your church. Most churches will not tell you what they pay their pastors. What they do is they put the one line item in your budget of salaries. And it's a pretty big effing number generally. And you are, though, allowed to go to your church leadership and ask, what are you paying the pastor? You are supposed to get that answer. And if they're not going to answer that question, you can report them. Canada, you can report them to the CRA. They need to be out there and telling you. And a church that doesn't tell you and is not transparent about the budget and their stuff, you need to ask them why. Something is shady. You need to know everything about your church if you're going to be a part of that. And they should be able to tell you everything. And if they don't, it's shady. And here's another thing. A church that wastes money is in sin. You're wasting God's resources by saying it's for God, but then wasting it. I can't tell you how many pastors have ripped off churches in the past too and stolen money. People steal from churches all the time. Pastors steal everything. Equipment, batteries, pens and pencils and everything, and paper. And a lot of people steal from churches and just like it's little, but they do. It happens a lot. People have stolen out of my office. People have stolen, who are on my worship team, headphones out of my own bucket, my own headphones. People steal from churches. It happens, and pastors do it too. So there it is. That is what I believe about tithing. That's going to be a game changer for a lot of people who think that you need to give to a church, because you absolutely don't. And so take with it what you will. Believe it or not, whatever. But again, do your own research. Don't believe me. Don't believe your other pastor. Don't believe everybody around you. Do your own research into it. That's the most important part here. Thanks for watching. Hit like and subscribe, hit the little bell, or don't, whatever. This was therapeutic. I loved it. I can't wait to talk more about these types of issues because I think Jesus wants me to. It sounds weird. I know it sounds like a tinfoil hat, but like I think there's some good stuff here to be had. And I know I am bashing a little bit. That's okay. Joel Osteen's a wiener. No one likes him. But let's move on to the next week. We're going to talk about, I think we're going to talk about getting more into like the budgetary things, about how the churches and how they're built and how much money actually is in this culture and the good and bad that comes from it. Stay tuned next week, Monday, for that. And I will see you then. I love you. You're amazing. Even if you don't love Jesus, it's okay. He loves you.